Hello, everybody here and out in video land. My name is Cynthia Cook, and I'm the president of the Clinton Historical Society. Welcome. We're delighted to have you with us this evening. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just go through a few announcements because it's always important to do that, keep you up to date on what's going on. The next big thing that's happening is a very big thing. On Tuesday, November 19th, here at the Creek Meeting House at 6 p.m., there is a town board sponsored workshop on the restoration of the Creek Meeting House. It's open to the public. We will have the architects here. We will all be here to talk about what our plans are and really introduce the project to our community. So I hope anybody who's out there will join us because that's going to be wonderful. There'll be a question and answer session and refreshments will be served, promise. And then December 7th is not only Pearl Harbor Day, but it's also the day of the craft fair here at the Creek Meeting House, the holiday craft fair to kick off the Christmas shopping season. So please mark your calendars for that. And this year, differently than past years, we're actually having our holiday potluck supper the following Friday on the 13th of December. So again, make sure you don't expect it to be back to back with the craft fair. We think it's just a little easier to take a week between the two events. And before we turn to the program tonight, I'd like to thank Elliot Werner, our program chair, for working with us and getting Zachary Veith to be with us. Kathy McMahon, who does the publicity, and Kathy and Jim Metcalf and Craig Marshall, who are working together to bring this to you as both a Zoom, well, as a hybrid program, in person and by Zoom. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Zachary. Zachary Veith is going to speak on slavery, segregation, and Staatsburg, the history and legacy of enslavement at Staatsburg State Historic Site, which for some of you older folks may remember it as also the Mills Mansion. Zachary Veith is the historic site assistant for Staatsburg State Historic Site in Staatsburg, New York. He is an early career museum professional, and his research has appeared in the Hudson River Valley Review, the Poughkeepsie Journal, and the Gotham Center for New York City History blog. He has presented public programs on a range of topics, from 19th century Black communities and cocktails of the Gilded Age to historic house museums across the Hudson Valley. He holds a BA in history from SUNY Geneseo out by Rochester and an MA in museum studies from University College London. So he is certainly well prepared to speak with us this evening. And without any further delay, please join us, Zachary.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach. Before I begin, here we go. I always like to give just a brief content warning before this presentation, because later on, about halfway through, we will be talking about racial violence and lynchings at some point in the conversation. So I just like to let folks know that ahead of time before we get there. But to jump right in May of 1790, John Jay, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, sat down at his desk in Boston to write a letter to his friend, Morgan Lewis. The newly appointed Chief Justice of the United States confirmed with Colonel Lewis that, quote, Peter should be free if he serves faithfully 7 years, adding, I shall shortly permit him to make his wife a visit, and that Peter speaks with much tenderness and affection about his son. With this letter that we see here on the screen, John Jay is finalizing the purchase of a fellow man named Peter Williams from Morgan Lewis, ripping him from his wife and child in the process. Today, this document remains the sole piece of evidence regarding enslavement in the archives of Staatsburg State Historic Site, as you said, the Mills Mansion, many people know it as. And it's where our story today begins. Now, for most people know Staatsburg as the Gilded Age country home of Ruth Livingston Mills, a prominent figure in New York high society, and her husband, the financier and philanthropist Ogden Mills. At Staatsburg, we discuss how the Gilded Age, roughly the 1870s to the 1910s, was not a golden age. Much like a gilded picture frame, the gilded beauty is just skin deep. You scratch away at that gold surface, you find just wood underneath. Underneath the Gilded Age glitter of Fifth Avenue wealth, you find thousands of New Yorkers living in poverty, subject to racial violence, prejudice throughout the Hudson Valley. But tonight, Slavery, Segregation, and Staatsburg aims to uncover the stories of Black people obscured underneath this narrative gilding of the wealthy white elites. This historical research underway at Staatsburg State Historic Site is examining the stories of the generations of Black people in and around the Staatsburg estate, beginning way back with our founding by Ruth Mills's great-grandfather, Morgan Lewis, here on the screen. For 4 years, I've been tracing the lives and the contexts of the Black men, women, and children on this one Hudson Valley estate. An estate that historically was part of Clinton. We were talking about this before Hyde Park is founded in 1821. Every time before that, and much of the history we're going to cover today, Staatsburg was part of the town of Clinton. So tonight, we're going to explore the world of these enslaved domestic servants for these early American aristocratic families, such as Morgan Lewis's, along the Hudson River. Then moving into the antebellum period, that period just before the American Civil War, we'll discuss the seismic shift in labor following emancipation in New York. And then we're going to wrap up our conversation by briefly looking at the growing Black community of the nearby hamlet of Staatsburg, the village, shut out of the all-white household of Staatsburg during the Gilded Age. So we're going to cover a long time span tonight. But I always begin my presentations the same way, by having everyone examine this letter. This is the letter written by John Jay to Staatsburg's founder, Morgan Lewis, that I read from earlier. And if you take a look, they're discussing the sale of a man named Peter Williams. John Jay writes, "I shall shortly permit him to make her," Peter Williams' wife, "a visit, and that Williams speaks with much tenderness and affection about his son." John Jay talks very matter-of-factly about Peter Williams' service in his household and this separation from his wife and child, who are still enslaved in Morgan Lewis's household. We see a family separation happening. This letter, I think, underscores the cold reality of slavery here in New York in the early years of the American Republic. Now, John Jay's insistence that Peter should be free if he serves faithfully 7 years in the Jay household was an unusual term limit that John Jay put on somebody held in bondage, a sort of built-in emancipation date, if you will. But think about it for a minute. Who is deciding if it's 7 years of faithful service? It was John Jay, and John Jay alone, who defined what faithful service meant. But this letter introduces some of the major themes for our discussion tonight: slavery, power, the Livingston families, networks in the Hudson Valley, and the multi-generational aspect of slavery. Now, Staatsburg, the Staatsburg estate, was first completed around 1796. This is actually the only image we have of the original Staatsburg mansion that was built by Morgan Lewis. But today's story begins long before the 1790s, because nearly as long as Europeans have been on the shores of the Hudson River, enslaved people have been held in bondage here. In fact, by 1703, New York City had the highest urban population of enslaved people outside of Charleston, South Carolina. So let's start by taking a look at the rise of Morgan Lewis, Staatsburg's founder, and slavery here in the Hudson Valley. Morgan Lewis was the son of Francis Lewis, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, as well as a documented enslaver. So young Morgan grew up in a household run by enslaved servants. Lewis went on to graduate from the College of New Jersey, which is today Princeton University, where he studied law under John Jay, that early connection to this founding generation. Shortly afterwards, during the War for Independence, he served as the Quartermaster General for New York State. He marries Gertrude Livingston, the sister to Chancellor Robert Livingston from Claremont. And over a long career, Morgan Lewis would serve as a New York Assemblyman, State Attorney General, Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, and ultimately governor in 1804. So all of this together, Morgan Lewis's marriage into the powerful Livingston family, his personal and political connections to the founding generation of America, underscore the connectedness of not only the Livingstons here in New York, but this whole elite class in early America. And as Morgan Lewis is increasing his wealth through tenant farmers and wool production on his estate, he's increasing his political power in Albany. Money was necessary for him to rise into the social strata of the American elites, and a symbol of their collective wealth was enslaved people. Until slavery is abolished in New York, the more wealth Morgan Lewis is earning, the more people he is enslaving to demonstrate that affluence. And so employing this upper class background, Morgan Lewis builds a close circle of peers: Chancellor Robert Livingston, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, all enslavers who were both legitimizing his social standing here in New York and reinforcing slavery in all of their homes. So by this point in his career, we've reached 1790. Now, before Staatsburg is built, Morgan and Gertrude Lewis are renting a home in the beautiful village of Rhinebeck. They rent the Grassmere estate, which is just south of the village. It's going to be a luxury spa in a couple of years. This is where we find the Lewis family on the first federal census taken in 1790. And in their household is listed 8 slaves. It's a category, it's a whole column on the US Census. You can see the 8 there that I've circled. Nothing more is known. They just know the head of the household, Morgan Lewis. It's likely Peter Williams, his wife, and Peter Williams' child are among those 8 listed, but we can't be sure. We don't know. We have no more information on those 8 individuals. But we know 4 years later, in 1794, it's documented by Mrs. Sarah Jay, John Jay's wife, that Morgan and Gertrude Lewis are still enslaving Peter's wife, who is unnamed in all of these letters, in their own households. Meanwhile, ironically, the John Jay children are lamenting at the heartache of their father leaving for a temporary assignment to England. So you have this Black family ripped apart for years, but you have John Jay's kids still lamenting their father going away for a temporary assignment. On that same assignment over to England, John Jay will bring Peter Williams with him over to London. English servants are mistreating Peter Williams in a variety of ways, while John Jay is networking with British abolitionists. As founding members of the New York Manumission Society, and manumission is the act of freeing somebody enslaved by an individual. So an individual is freeing somebody, as opposed to emancipation, which is when a state is freeing people, like the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln. So as founding members of the New York Manumission Society, campaigning for the freedom of enslaved people, both John Jay and Morgan Lewis are navigating these opposing sides, proto-abolitionist and enslaver, with ease. Powerful New Yorkers, including Chancellor Robert Livingston, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Morgan Lewis, are all members of this manumission society. The names of these enslavers and many other among the prominent members exemplifies a core contradiction of their character. 1 out of every 5 members enslaves human beings. So as with many in this founding generation, Morgan Lewis is struggling. He's conflicted with these paradoxical views of the institution. Now, one way that enslaved Black people exercised their own agency at this time was self-emancipating or running away from their enslaver. These freedom seekers did not wait for their enslaver to grant them freedom. They took it themselves. They did it on their own terms. And runaway advertisements, putting out a notice of these freedom seekers, were common to read here in the Hudson Valley well into the 19th century. Several runaway notices survive from the hamlet of Staatsburg, spanning several decades. We can see here on the screen an advertisement for a man named Levi, an enslaved man standing about 5'8" tall with a slight stoop, who self-emancipated from his enslaver, Job Mulford, wearing a pale blue coat, black felt hat, brown trousers, in October of 1779. 3 years later, another man, Dick, self-emancipated from Mulford as well, who had suspected the 22-year-old Black man intended to cross into the British lines during the final stages of the American Revolution. Bob, here on the screen, is another enslaved man laboring in the hamlet of Staatsburg. 18 years old, Bob stood about 5'7", spoke English with some Dutch, with a speech impediment, and lost one of the joints on his left hand. Along with the clothes on his back, Bob took 3 shirts, including a new muslin one, 3 pairs of pants, a coat, and a vest. So Bob was prepared for anything. His enslaver, Christopher Hughes, a local prominent farmer in the Staatsburg village, put out this advertisement for Bob on July 4th, Independence Day, 1803. The American Revolution of 1776 had failed men like Bob long before 1803. But he would show that Black people were able and willing to seize their freedom by any means. The same year that Peter Williams and John Jay sailed for England, Morgan Lewis's name is recorded in a runaway slave advertisement for a man named Plato, here on the screen. The listing notes that Plato lived sometime with the Honorable Morgan Lewis, Esquire of Rhinebeck. So he's no longer enslaved by Morgan Lewis. You can see somebody else is putting out this advertisement. But he lived for some time with Morgan Lewis and maybe lurking in that neighborhood. Note the term lurking. It's a very powerful word. Describing him as 5'6", roughly 31 years old, of a Black complexion, well set, and of an unpleasant countenance. I wonder why. While these notices can be read as dehumanizing within the larger context of slavery, itself a dehumanizing institution, the great professor of Black studies, A.J. Williams Myers from SUNY New Paltz, argued that these notices can provide a little bit of humanity to those held in bondage through the names and descriptions provided by their enslavers. Reading these descriptions, you learn the skills these people had, the languages they spoke. You learn maybe some of their family networks, their connections. In fact, this is the best physical description and overall description we have of anybody enslaved or formerly enslaved by Morgan Lewis that we'll talk about tonight. Now, in this advertisement, we also can see Plato was described as wearing a long corduroy coat with green collar and cuffs, buckskin breeches, and a striped waistcoat, which is one heck of an outfit. I'd love to see it. It's likely a livery uniform. At our sister site, Claremont State Historic Site, the author William Strickland, that same year, was served breakfast by, quote, 4 Negro boys, the oldest about 11 or 12, barefoot, but dressed in livery. The use of livery appears to be a constant in the mansions dotting the Hudson River. As with all uniforms, the waistcoat, the breeches demonstrate the wearer's position in a social hierarchy. The livery of a footman, whether enslaved in the early republic or free during the Gilded Age, underscores his service role within these estates. And lastly, my last note on Plato is his name, a rather unusual name, right? Cultural isolation was key to removing those enslaved from their own cultural heritage and ingraining a new Western heritage onto them. The world these domestics is supporting, such as this fine dining image you see here, the dinner party from around that era. The world these domestics are supporting is simultaneously Europeanizing them while isolating them from their native African cultures. Western style names like Plato, like Peter Williams, appear much more frequently on documents than African names. We'll talk more about sort of the naming practices in a little bit, but generations of people of African descent enslaved in the Hudson Valley have been described by one historian as culturally Dutch. And speaking of the Dutch, does anybody know who Isabella Baumfree is? Her picture's on the screen. Isabella Baumfree is the birth name of famed abolitionist Sojourner Truth, born into slavery here in the Hudson Valley. Baumfree was originally her father's nickname, which roughly translates to tall tree in Dutch. And Sojourner Truth spoke Dutch as her first language until she was about 9 years old. So thus we see this Europeanizing of the culture and the domestic knowledge of those enslaved, better enabling them to serve their white enslavers. Sojourner Truth was born around 1797. We're not really sure when exactly, but around 1797, just a few years after Morgan Lewis completes his country estate that he calls Staatsburg along the opposite banks of the Hudson River. So young Isabella Baumfree, living on the Ulster County side, was a contemporary of the 9 people of African descent Morgan Lewis enslaved here on the eastern shores of the Hudson. Stephen, Belinda, Mary, William, and Dinah. Those are the only 5 names known to have been held in bondage at Staatsburg. And we're going to take a look at their lives now a little bit closer. In 1811, a couple years later, Morgan Lewis is one of the founders of St. James Episcopal Church in Hyde Park, right across the street from the Vanderbilt estate. It's where Franklin Roosevelt went to church, very famously. I figured that would be a good source of information for this research, births, deaths, maybe marriages. So thumbing through the church records in the local Hyde Park Historical Society, I found listed the names Stephen, William, Mary, and Dinah. They were all baptized on December 1st, 1811, under the sponsorship of their enslaver, Morgan and Gertrude Lewis. You can see here on the screen. They're some of the first baptisms in the new church. The church was only built in 1811. And as you can see here, these are some of the first baptisms are those of enslaved people from the wealthy river families. Nathaniel Pendleton is right under him. John McVicker, the name above Morgan Lewis, is actually the pastor at St. James. He's baptizing his enslaved individuals. Unfortunately, we don't know anything more about these individuals from this record. We don't know how old they are. We don't know their relations. If we fast forward a few generations, Morgan Lewis's granddaughter, a woman named Julia Livingston Delafield, writes a biography about her grandfather and his own father, Francis, which she fittingly calls the biographies of Francis Lewis and Morgan Lewis. It's a very boring name, but it's been a major source for the names of those enslaved by her ancestors and Ruth Livingston Mills's ancestors. And I'd like to quote her description of two women. She writes, quote, "Belinda and Mary were colored women, liberated slaves. Belinda was a little older than my mother, and once nearly drowned her and a litter of kittens by overturning a basket in which they were all cuddling up together in a well in the cellar. She was pensioned by my mother until her death." So Belinda and Mary, these two women, are mentioned in the biography of Morgan Lewis, quoted in a letter written by Morgan Lewis to his wife, Gertrude. Gertrude is going down to New York to open up their New York City home, and Morgan Lewis says, "Oh, take with you Belinda and Mary. They can be spared from Staatsburg." So as Mary's name appears in that earlier baptismal record that we looked at, there's no doubt she, and most likely Belinda, are enslaved at some point by Morgan Lewis. They're probably not wearing livery like Plato, but they're working behind the scenes as cooks or maids, both at Staatsburg and Morgan Lewis's New York City home. From Julia's description that I had read, we can guess that Belinda was born roughly around 1780, because she says she's a little bit older than her mother, who is Morgan Lewis's daughter. So Belinda is roughly the age of Morgan Lewis's own daughter. And in the records of all of these upper class enslavers that I'm talking about tonight, there's a bias when it comes to recording those they enslave. Those inside the home, like Belinda and Mary, are more likely to be remembered and noted by members of the family, such as the granddaughter, Julia, because they're interacting intimately with the family. This is compared to enslaved people laboring on the farms and the estates across Dutchess County, who've largely been overlooked in a lot of the records and a lot of the biographies and memorials written by the white families. And on that note, my focus for much of this project is domestic service. Local tenant farmers alongside white indentured servants and black enslaved laborers were the agricultural labor force for these large riverfront estates like Staatsburg. Morgan Lewis's rent book, which is here on the screen, survives in Staatsburg's collections and contains the name of all of his tenant farmers, all of the local men who are renting land from him and paying him in wheat and barley. That's their rent. But only recently, I've been able to go through the federal census and match the names of documented enslavers with men in Morgan Lewis's rent book. And consistent with records that we found at Claremont, the landlord is enslaving a larger group of individuals, while further down the economic ladder, the tenant farmers are enslaving one or two people in their households. I'm particularly interested in the individual enslaved by Franklin Peck, who is a miller at Lewis's Wittenberg Mills, sort of in between Staatsburg and Rhinebeck. The first documented instance that we've been able to find of enslaved labor at Lewis's milling operations, another big source of wealth for the family. And unfortunately, the rent book does not give any biographical details on any of the men that are paying rent to Morgan Lewis, while the census records do not state if that man was a tenant farmer or not. So thus, these findings matching the names in the rent book to the names in the census is not with 100% certainty. There's no way to know for certain, for example, if the Ebenezer Wood of Rhinebeck, who rented land from Morgan Lewis starting in 1805, is the same Ebenezer Wood of Rhinebeck who is enslaving one individual in 1810. But it's likely, it's probably the same guy, but we can't know for certain. But at this point, our research right now is focusing on the enslaved people who, as named in the existing records, performed domestic duties inside the landlord's house. And these enslaved servants, especially those at an important household like Staatsburg, you have to remember, this is the governor's mansion in the early 1800s. They are masters of their crafts. Public advertisements and private letters alike attest to the immense skill and high level of talent of Black men and women in our region across a variety of domestic roles. These landowning families depended on those they enslaved to maintain their homes and their above average standard of living. So Dinah, Belinda, Mary would be found performing duties like food preparation, clothing repairs, household cleaning in Morgan Lewis's household. Now, to gain an idea of a little bit of their lives, we have to look beyond the records created by the white family and look to records created by local Black residents. So we look to Sojourner Truth's The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave, her autobiography. As I said, Truth was born around 1797, so she's younger than we think Belinda is, but they're roughly contemporaries. But in her narrative, Sojourner Truth recalls sleeping on damp floorboards in a cramped, dismal chamber with very little light below her enslaver's house. As was common in other riverfront mansions, the enslaved people's quarters at Staatsburg was either in the hot attic or the damp basement of their enslavers' homes. Truth was repeatedly sold, separating her from her parents and her family, similar to what we saw a generation earlier with Peter Williams and his family. Under one of her enslavers, John Neely of Kingston, Sojourner Truth details horrible whippings, inhumane conditions. There's this myth that slavery was somehow easier in the North. However, the physical violence, the emotional trauma associated with Southern plantation slavery is very much present here in the Hudson Valley as well. Now, beyond that 1811 baptismal record, the individual Stephen is mentioned by Julia Delafield again in her biography of Morgan Lewis. And Julia writes, quote, Stephen was a manumitted slave, the son of Belinda. He was the general's body servant during the war. The general had provided for him in his will, but he did not live to enjoy his good fortune. So again, we return to this theme of domestic servants enslaved by Morgan Lewis. Stephen is an enslaved man remembered as the body servant to Morgan Lewis, the general, as Julia called him. The son of Belinda, a woman enslaved by Lewis, who we've met. It's unknown when Stephen is born, but if Belinda is roughly the age of Morgan Lewis's daughter, Stephen is roughly the age of his enslaver's grandchildren when he's owned by him. And as his body servant, Stephen served with General Lewis as his personal aide during the War of 1812. That's the war she refers to. Stephen likely laid out the general's uniform and delivered messages across the Niagara and Upper Canada frontiers where they were serving during the War of 1812. Following the war, Stephen would have tended to Lewis's personal needs at his residences both in New York City and up here in Staatsburg, such as dressing him, organizing paperwork, and perhaps serving meals to Staatsburg's distinguished guests from Marquis de Lafayette to Joseph Bonaparte in the 1820s. As Julia mentioned, family lore stated that Morgan Lewis included Stephen in his will, yet Lewis would go on to outlive Stephen. And so his will was later rewritten, does not have any mention of Stephen, unfortunately. Those 5 known names of those enslaved at Staatsburg bear repeating: Belinda, Mary, William, Stephen, and Dinah. The other names, we know there were more people enslaved. The other names have been lost for now to history. Now, nearly 2 decades earlier than everything I've been talking about, just a few years after Staatsburg is completed, abolition was passed in New York State. However, it was the 1799 Act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And it stated that a child born to an enslaved woman after July 4th, symbolic date, 1799, was free. But that child had to serve their mother's enslaver until the age of 28 if they were a male, or 25 if they were a female. Those born before July 4th, 1799, were not granted emancipation. So effectively, this 1799 act frees no one immediately. Enslavers like Morgan Lewis could and did continue to profit off the labors of those they enslaved for decades to come. And the census clearly bears all this out. Over 63% of Black people in Dutchess County, just over 1,600 individuals, are still held in bondage the following year, 1800, which is less than a 17% decrease from the decade before. So you can see this is going to be a gradual process. In fact, that same year, 1800, the town of Clinton, which includes present-day Staatsburg, had the third highest enslaved population in Dutchess County, with just under 75% of its Black population enslaved in the town. Now, this act for gradual abolition was updated in 1817. As with the 1799 act, though, this 1817 act frees no one immediately. Finally, on July 4th, 1827, nearly 4 decades after Morgan Lewis's sale of Peter Williams to John Jay, slavery in New York officially ends. When 1827 marks the official end of slavery in New York, Black people remained at Staatsburg as the servants for the family. And the 1830 census notes there were 4 Black residents, unnamed, unfortunately, living in the Lewis Livingston household at Staatsburg. The following decade, 1840, that number jumps to 5. That's a 25% increase in the Black labor force on the estate. Meanwhile, the white families' numbers are diminishing as children and grandchildren grow up and move away. Newly freed Black people often found it difficult, however, to reestablish themselves outside of their former enslavers' home. With little to no resources, little savings, few networks outside of the estate, limited options for transportation, there are countless examples of formerly enslaved people staying and working on the estate of their former enslavers. Now, when I first started this project, way back in October of 2020, there was a rumor everybody told me that there were Black servants at Morgan Lewis's funeral. You have to look into them. That was one of the first leads that I got for this research project, and I was able to track down the quote from one brief eyewitness account. Now, Morgan Lewis dies in 1844, the ripe age of 89. In the 1930s, there's an article published discussing the Black population of Dutchess County, and the author quotes an eyewitness who recalled Morgan Lewis's funeral, saying, "The general's body was borne by his colored servants in full livery. 2 were Caesar and Pompey, while the names of the others she could not recall." So in 1840, as I said, there were 5 Black people living in Staatsburg, but since the individual names are not listed, we may never know if they include these 2 individuals, Caesar and Pompey. But not only does this brief episode provide a glimpse into the household of Staatsburg at the time of Morgan Lewis's death, it provides parallels to an episode 5 decades earlier, Plato's Escape. First, there's singular, unusual, droll names: Plato, Caesar, Pompey. While Caesar and Pompey are likely newly emancipated men, they carry this reminder of their bondage. naming those enslaved with these curious, to many people, these amusing European names, thus stripping them further of their African heritage, labeled these individuals as the other, distinguishing them as beneath their enslaver and other white people. I've talked to a few colleagues of mine who do similar research, and we've noted every time we see a Caesar or a Pompey or a Jupiter or a Diana or one of these classical names, we instantly know that person was probably formerly enslaved. It's a telltale sign. And a second similarity is their dress. The eyewitness to Morgan Lewis's funeral mentioned Caesar and Pompey were dressed in livery at the time. Plato, if you remember, was also dressed in that sort of outrageous livery uniform. So the waistcoat, the jacket, the breeches, trousers later of a footman we see as this constant thread from Black men in the early 1800s to, as we will see, white European men in the 1900s at Staatsburg. Morgan Lewis's daughter, Margaret Lewis, who marries also into the Livingston family, so Margaret Lewis Livingston, the grandmother of our own Ruth Livingston Mills, takes up the reins of maintaining the Staatsburg estate following her father's death. And this is the 1850 census, showing the Staatsburg household under Margaret's control. We see listed Fanny, down towards the bottom, Fanny, a 35-year-old Black Maryland-born servant to Margaret Livingston and her family. Oddly, there is a ditto mark that I've circled there, listed where her last name should be, a common shorthand for census takers that the previous name continues down, the previous last name continues down. But the name above is Ellen Kane, a white Irish-born servant with likely no relation to Black Maryland-born Fanny below. 23 years after New York's emancipation is codified, Fanny is now the last Black servant recorded at Staatsburg. Ellen Kane represents the beginnings of the rising tide of European domestic labor at these riverfront estates, including Staatsburg. Now, outside of Staatsburg, outside of this one estate, there's this growing tension between Black and immigrant, most often Irish, communities in antebellum America. Black communities in New York saw these masses of European immigrants hungry for work as their most direct labor threat. Frederick Douglass, wearing just a fabulous floral waistcoat. You can just see it peeking out there. Frederick Douglass wrote that Black people were constantly, quote, elbowed out of some employment to make room for some newly arrived immigrant from the Emerald Isle, whose hunger and color entitle him to special favor. So those two characteristics, hunger and color, outlined by Frederick Douglass, I think outline this shift from Black servants to European servants in antebellum New York. The first hunger, that's hunger for work. And sometimes literal hunger, fueled by desperation brought on by, for example, the Irish potato famine. Women are immigrating to the United States in mass in the 1840s. These women, like Ellen Kane at Staatsburg, are delaying marriage. They're accepting slightly lower wages for the chance to work in New York. They are the perfect candidates for domestic service. And of course, second is color. The historian Noel Ignatieff argued that competition was distorted by the color line. In the solidifying racial hierarchy of the United States, newly arrived immigrants, the lowest on the social hierarchy, could still consider themselves above any Black citizen because of the color of their skin alone. So thus the ideas of what is a white man's work, what is a Black man's work, were shifting in the decades before the Civil War. White European immigrants are increasingly taking service jobs such as cooks, butlers, servants, pushing out the Black men and women who made up that class for generations. So at mid-century, the middle of the 1800s, we've reached a turning point. Morgan Lewis's life and his wider early Republic world exemplified what one historian called the everydayness of slavery. It was deeply baked in. But coming onto the eve of the Civil War, that same historian labeled the institution New York's skeleton in the attic, as Northern slavery did not fit our narrative during the Civil War. We were the free North. There was no slavery here. And the stage is now set for the Gilded Age. On June 1st, 1890, 100 years after John Jay wrote to Morgan Lewis from that desk in Boston, the Mohonk Mountain House became in nearby New Paltz, New York, right across the river, became a site of gathering and debate. White educators, clergymen, and political leaders gathered on that warm June weekend for the first Mohonk Conference on the Negro Question. On the morning of the first day, to an all-white audience, General Samuel Armstrong said, quote, "The Negro is back in the Iron Age, but the white race is in its golden age." Our designation of a Gilded Age in the late 1800s, remember, only applies to a fraction of the population in America. Following the Civil War, the dawn of the Gilded Age saw renewed questions over the ability of freedmen to integrate into what was perceived as a white man's society. This is the so-called Negro question. Can Black people integrate into society? For scholars of Black history, the Gilded Age, late 1800s, early 1900s, is often referred to as the nadir, or the lowest point in post-emancipation race relations. There's this increasing sense of white supremacy that materialized throughout Northern society to oppress the Black other. Rights won by African Americans immediately after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, seats in Congress, equal protections, are being slowly eroded away during the Gilded Age. The view that Black people could not assimilate into a modern American society, coupled with the growing ideology of racial purity, quote unquote, sciences, quote unquote, left Black communities out of large portions of society, including New York's high society at Staatsburg. Now, beyond the high stone walls of the Staatsburg estate where I work lies the small hamlet of Staatsburg, the picturesque little village there. What started as a small farming community in Morgan Lewis's era ballooned into an industrious riverside town during his great-granddaughter Ruth's lifetime, full of hotels, restaurants, train yards, factories, and of course the famous estates along the Hudson River. As I mentioned, Fanny, who we met earlier, was the last Black servant in the Staatsburg mansion in 1850. But I began to ask myself, what if there was a Black population in the surrounding hamlet of Staatsburg? And if so, what was the Gilded Age like for them? Well, the 1875 New York State Census, we see a small enclave of Black homeowners emerging just 3 miles north of Staatsburg. So there's a little icon there to represent the Staatsburg mansion, and the star at the top, close to the border with Rhinebeck, is where we find this small enclave. DeWitt Hasbrook, a Black Civil War veteran, is now a laborer in 1875, creating equity on his own land in the hamlet, the larger geographic area of Staatsburg, alongside his wife, Amelia. Amelia's parents, Samuel and Clara Clark, represented by the other star, settled in Staatsburg by the 1850s and are living right next door to their son-in-law and their daughter. Down the road from the Clarks and the Hasbrooks is the Dillon family. Next door is the home of Robert St. John, a Black freedom seeker from Brazil, who settled in the Hudson Valley on land that he bought from Samuel Clark in the 1860s. He's a fascinating. I could give a whole talk on Robert St. John. He's so interesting. Black boarders and tenants are also numerous among this community we see popping up. Oh, notification. The livelihoods listed in the following census, the federal census taken in 1880, however, demonstrate the limited economic opportunities for this African-American community. The service industry and physical labor are the prescribed roles for most Black people during the Gilded Age. Yet these are precisely the roles being overtaken with European immigrants in New York every single day. Jane Jenkins, a young Black maid living in Hyde Park, for example, is working alongside Mary Dolan, a young Irish servant in a Hyde Park household. So we see these Black and white households for a little bit. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s, the Great Migration is increasingly bringing Black Southern migrants to Staatsburg. In 1900, these Southern-born Black men have increasingly moved into the service of white households in the area as butlers, waiters, coachmen, while Black women in Staatsburg are almost exclusively in the domestic service of white employers. The employers of these men and women underscore the great wealth of the small Staatsburg village. In 1900, Elizabeth Tuttle is a maid for the owner of the local department store. Lila Strathus works for the farm superintendent on the Ogden Mills estate. Annie Hinton is actually a maid for the rector of the local church in town. As well, by 1900, Ruth Livingston Mills at the Staatsburg estate is employing a small army of servants to cater to her every need. But in the sense, excuse me, in every census listing for the Mills family, whether down in New York City or up in Staatsburg, there are no Black domestic employees named, unlike the other residents that I had previously mentioned. And the difference appears to be wealth. The employers of Black servants are the middle class. They're the farm managers, they're the merchants, they're the rectors. The wealthy estate owners, the one percenters, if you will, including the Mills, including the Dinsmores, the Huntingtons, are all employing white servants on their estates. So as the wealthiest estate in Staatsburg, the Mills household was exclusively a white space, leaving Black servants to seek employment in middle-income households. To again quote Frederick Douglass a generation earlier, Black servants like Caesar and Fanny were elbowed out of some employment to make room for some newly arrived immigrant from the Emerald Isle at Staatsburg and in New York's high society in general. These Gilded Age mansions were Europeanizing, presenting themselves as American aristocrats in European palaces, and thus their staff had to fit that image. English butlers, Irish maids, French chefs. So further demonstrating this racial and class divide in the Gilded Age is this Baltimore Sun newspaper published in 1912. One column notes the British Princess Patricia visited Ruth Mills at her Fifth Avenue home for lunch. The news column on their left, you have the very dramatic headline, 4 Negroes lynched. 100 men had kidnapped 4 Black people from the Harris County Jail in Georgia the previous night and lynched them. Lynching was on the rise in the United States during the Gilded Age. A lynching is the public killing of an individual who has not received any due process, often carried out by lawless white mobs to terrorize and control Black people. In Port Jervis, right across the river in Orange County, excuse me, on June 2nd, 1892, Robert Lewis was lynched by a mob of 2,000 white people after they accused him of assaulting a white woman. Lewis was dragged to a nearby tree and hanged for a crime he may not have committed after receiving no trial. So Black citizens fleeing violence and segregation down south are met with further violence and segregation in Gilded Age New York. Separate Black and white facilities were not a Southern-only practice. As we've seen, New York hosted Jim Crow prejudice as well. Across New York City, in fact, public institutions from churches and theaters to athletic clubs and saloons began segregating facilities or outright banning Black patrons. This too is Gilded Age New York. Those Southern migrants drawn to Staatsburg by the Great Migration North, however, did not stay long. The promise of better paying jobs elsewhere, memories of racially motivated attacks close to home, must have been driving forces. By 1910, we see only one Black resident in the entire Staatsburg village. Ivy Watson, a 16-year-old Barbadian immigrant, is employed as a maid by the local lawyer at his home. DeWitt and Amelia Hasbrook, their son, George, and his family, who were formerly living in Staatsburg, have relocated to Oak Street in Rhinebeck, a historically Black community further north, alongside other Black family members. The draw to be amongst a community of one's own, the safety that brings with it, drove Black people elsewhere, outside of Staatsburg. So I want to leave you tonight by remembering it was a Gilded Age, not a golden age. Examining the stories underneath the white narrative at Staatsburg presents a fuller picture of the supporting Black lives hidden underneath. Saying the names of those Morgan Lewis enslaved, Plato, Peter Williams, Belinda, Mary, Stephen, William, Dinah, as well as discussing Pompey and Caesar, gives these individuals a little bit of their humanity back. Slavery in the Hudson Valley, I think, is still an overshadowed aspect of local history for many people, and presenting the difficult lives of somebody enslaved along the banks of the Hudson River, from naming practices designed to culturally isolate someone to the physical isolation of family separations, from the living quarters of multiple people under their enslaver's roof to the knowledge brought by those same people to their crafts, is only the first step for us. This research into the lives of these men and women, I hope, can provide a new aspect, a new perspective on Staatsburg. Exploring how Black people navigated this world from service in mansions to competition for those same service jobs reveals the struggles of generations of Black New Yorkers. The era of Jim Crow saw the denial of rights, increase in prejudice here in the Hudson Valley. I have another program that if the Clinton Historical Society will have me back, I have a part 2 of this research called Black Staatsburg, taking a deeper dive into this Gilded Age history of the Black community of Staatsburg. That I've only just scratched the surface of it. There's new research I'm finding every single day, which is a whole other program that we do also at Staatsburg as well. But navigating these larger contexts of racial attitudes in the Gilded Age and the earlier history in the early Republic is just the beginning of new understandings into the history of Staatsburg. We are exploring the origins and the legacy of slavery in our online blog series, Enslaved and in Service, which you can check out by following that QR code. So Staatsburg is ready to begin telling this story of the enslaved individuals and the racial makeup that's so central to our history. Thank you so much for having me tonight.
I just want to say thank you, Zach, on behalf of those of us gathered here, and also those of you who are watching us by Zoom. And I wonder if Zach would be willing to answer questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, I will get out of the chair and let him do it.
Zach, one of the rewards you showed up there was like $50 and 1,700. That seems like an awful lot of money. I don't know what that would be today, but
I wish I had done, yeah, I don't know what the conversion is, but what $50 would be in that time period. I don't know that, but it does seem like a lot of money. I know both Mulford and Hughes, I forget who put out that specific ad. They're very prominent farmers. They're very wealthy farmers. There are streets named after both of them today in Staatsburg. They're large landowners. So I think it shows both, you know, the wealth of that individual, of either Mulford or Hughes, but also how much they valued the labor of this enslaved person, that they're willing to pay $50 in 1780s money for him to be returned to them, so as a reward. Yeah, but gosh, I got to find out the conversion of that. I'll do that tomorrow first thing.
I think another possibility is that when he puts a high price on it, discourages other people from escaping. Because they know, wow, it's gonna be $50, they're gonna find it.
Yeah, and it's incentive for somebody to go out. Incentive probably for someone also not to harbor him. If somebody's thinking about, ooh, $50, that's a good amount of money probably. Yeah, there's a whole lot wrapped up into that. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
Could you, for those of us on Zoom, just
Yes.
repeat the question when you're given it so we can hear it a little bit better?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry about that. The question was about the $50 reward on one of the earlier runaway notices.
I see. Thank you.
But we have a question also here live.
I was under the impression that the Great Migration mainly into urban industrial areas, there were factory jobs, and that's not other than to rural areas.
Yeah. So the question here was about the Great Migration. They had heard that the Great Migration they thought was mostly to urban areas, you know, New York City, Chicago, which is true. The Great Migration at the turn of the century is largely going to those urban centers, but it's not for most families, most individuals, it's not a direct shot from Louisiana to Chicago or Georgia to New York. They're stopping along the way and they're spending a couple months, couple years here, couple months, couple years here. So I found a lot of these Southern migrants coming north, perhaps hearing, oh, there's an evergreen need for servants here in the Hudson Valley. They can spend however much time here, and then their next stop is probably New York or Boston or Pittsburgh or Kingston or Poughkeepsie, you know, staying somewhat locally. So the Great Migration, yes, ultimately many of them go to the great industrial cities of the North, but there's multiple stops along the way. So we see that happening. There's one family that I found in my research, the Johnsons, Charles and Eliza Johnson, I think is his wife's name. Charles, the son of enslaved people from Virginia. The Great Migration, Charles moves north. He's in Wappingers. In one census, he moves to Poughkeepsie for a couple years. He's in Staatsburg very briefly. And then the family finally settles in Newburgh, sort of this growing, you know, river city. So we see them, you know, we see these families moving around at that time, not just going to one center. Good question.
As the African-American servants were being displaced by Irish particularly, where were the blacks going after that? Do you have any sense of what befell them next?
Yeah. I assume Zoom heard that, but if you didn't, the question was, what happens to the black servants after they're displaced by European Irish servants? They're finding work elsewhere. They're working for, you know, lower income families. They're not working for the wealthy anymore. They're working for like the middle class. The middle class won't hire them. They're going into more agricultural jobs. You know, I'd love to be able to track some of these people following their service in Staatsburg. Like what happens to Fanny? I don't know what happens to Fanny after 1850. She's, she's 35. She's got her whole life ahead of her. I don't know what happens to her, but I think most of them either find work elsewhere as domestic servants for other families or go into agriculture. Are there any questions from Zoom?
Yes. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any information on, like, in the South, whether there were Black churches type, groups that got together? Maybe there weren't enough of them to have what would be the foundation of Black churches?
Yeah. So the people here did not hear. The question was about Black churches. If there are Black churches like we see in the South. There are Black churches I found only in areas where there's a sizable number of African Americans, which is usually in more urban centers. So there are Black churches in Poughkeepsie, there are Black churches in Kingston, but Staatsburg, Clinton, Rhinebeck does not have, or did not have, a sizable enough Black population, during this time of either enslavement or post-slavery, to have their own Black churches. It's the same with schools as well. There are no segregated Black schools except for in Poughkeepsie, where there's a large enough population, or in Kingston, where there's a large enough population. So I know some of the Black families during the Gilded Age have children living in Staatsburg. We know they're going to school. I don't know where they're going to school, but they're probably going to either the Staatsburg school or they're going up to Rhinebeck to school. There are no separate Black churches or schools in the area. They're fairly integrated. And actually, St. James has an interesting history. St. James Church that we talked about, that's founded by Morgan Lewis. Powerful members of the town of Clinton are going to church there. The Bards, Morgan Lewis, Nathaniel Pendleton, big names at the time. The sexton, the caretaker for St. James, is a man named Richard Jenkins. He's a formerly enslaved man from the Bards who goes on to earn a living as the caretaker for St. James. He has a pew in St. James, and in fact, he's buried in St. James. So it's a not segregated cemetery. His grave is only a few yards away from the governor of New York's grave, Morgan Lewis. You can see both of them from the same point. So St. James is fairly integrated.
Do you know of were there Black congregants as part of the St. James Church?
So the question was about Black congregants at St. James, and that's an interesting question because I know of free Black families having their children baptized at St. James. Caesar Clark, for example, Caesar Clark, we know he's probably formerly enslaved, is having his son baptized at St. James. We see the deaths of free Black residents noted in the St. James archives and their record books. Susan Peters dies in 1854. Her death is noted. So they have some connection to the church. Their deaths, their baptisms, some of their weddings are being recorded in the archives. So presumably they are going to church there. And I think there's one family, I think it's the Peters family, who are listed as like subscribers to the church. So they are actually, integrated and active in the St. James Church, at that time in the 1830s, 40s, 1850s. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just a comment, jumping ahead to the early 20th century, we have some wonderful photographs from the one-room schoolhouse here in Clinton Corners that shows an integrated classroom
Hmm.
with, I think they were, you know their names, don't you, Greg? The black kids, yeah,
He was a member of the society, he
Yeah.
and his brother.
Oh, wonderful.
They're about 8 years old in the picture.
Wow.
It's a quick corner school.
very cute.
Yeah,
Cute.
yeah. What a great thing to have. Great picture to
Yeah.
have.
And then another comment, if you don't mind,
Sure.
I remember from my time I was at the Roosevelt Library, and during the time that the Roosevelts went to Washington, Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to hire black servants in the White House,
Hmm.
which was the practice then. And it was again one of the points of contention with Sarah, coming from this tradition
Sure.
that
She probably had European servants.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that another anecdote to bear out
Yeah.
that observation of yours, that research of yours.
And it, I think it speaks to that difference between the North and the South. Washington, DC, we forget is the South. Which is a whole other history that I haven't even touched with this, because there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences.
That occurred to me when Elliot asked the question about the Black migration. I mean, it may just simply be that the similarities of the Hudson Valley were similar to the plantation South. So that maybe this wasn't the normal Black migration to the urban areas as much as a comfortable migration into an agricultural and aristocratic society.
I would say not so much those folks coming from the South during the Great Migration at the turn of the century. All of them, all the people I found from South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, all of that, they're all working domestically. They're all maids, they're all butlers, they're all coachmen, cooks. So I think they're more drawn to the wealth of the Hudson Valley, who need servants.
But don't you think would be a step up? I mean.
Oh, I think
you see what I'm
absolutely.
saying is,
Yeah.
Rural Blacks who might see this as an
Absolutely.
opportunity.
Yeah, I would
Rural
think
Southern Blacks.
coachman is a step up from, farm laborer.
Fair that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Greg,
When an enslaved woman gives birth to a child, does that child automatically become property of her master? And if so, does he or she automatically become a member of the enslaved staff at a given age when they're counted as an enslaved?
so the question for those on Zoom was, if an enslaved woman gives birth to a child, is that child automatically enslaved? What is the legal context of all of that? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That when that child is born, they are enslaved by their mother's enslaver. Slavery was something that was, I don't want to use the term passed down, but it's passed through your mother. It's traced through your mother. So if your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved.
But there must have been an age when they were counted as a slave. I mean, a 3-year-old would not be counted, I would guess.
I think they would be counted. I think they probably would be counted. That's the tricky thing with those early census records. The column just notes how many slaves do you have. So it doesn't say, well, we have somebody who's 3, we have somebody who's 65, we have somebody who's 45. It's just a blanket term. So they're probably counting them. That's part of their wealth too. That child will grow up to be, your manservant or your cook or something like that. So they're probably counting them, I would imagine.
We know whether, when they were in the 1840s, do we know whether in the churches they were sitting with the white people, or whether they were confined like to the balcony or something like that?
The question goes back to churches. If in the 1840s, post-slavery, if the Black congregants are sitting integrated in the pews with the white congregants, or if they're in a separate area, that's something I don't know. I'd love to know. The only hint I have to that is there's a seating diagram from the early years of St. James, and the only Black person I can see is the sexton, Richard Jenkins, the caretaker. And his pew is the very last pew at the very back. But I don't know if that's because he's the caretaker or because he's black or because it's both. I don't know.
What year is that?
That's probably like 1820, I think is when that diagram is
So
from.
slavery was not over yet.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't have a seating chart from post-slavery.
I guess the factor would be after 1827 or before 1827, how they were counted was the slavery flatly ended in 1827.
But did it flatly end? I think,
July 4th, 1827.
but there were
some of the,
still,
there was a layover, yeah.
yeah, I mean, there were still enslaved people
Yeah.
recorded in 1840 and the New York Federal
Yes.
Census return.
Yeah,
Yes.
Because of the birth period.
for another 20, what was it, 27 years?
Yeah,
Yeah, 28 or 25. So the date was July 4th, 1827. But if you're a black kid born July 3rd, 1827, you still have that period you have to serve. But after 1827, they're reclassified as indentured servants. So it's
Right.
they're slaves by a slightly different classification. It really gets very, very complicated after that.
By the Gilded Age, would have been after the Civil War. Gilded Age, you mean the 1890s?
Yeah, yeah.
After the Civil War, slavery was abolished by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, so there's a whole new. Is that your question as well? After the Civil War, when slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment, yes, that's another chapter.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the comment was after the Civil War, after slavery ends, really nationwide, that's a whole other chapter. Yeah, that's a whole other way to think about race relations here in New York. What's going on? How does the Civil War change things? I haven't looked in my own research. I haven't looked too much really at the Civil War, but it does obviously pop up in a couple ways. The Civil War for African Americans in New York, we're generations out from slavery in New York by the time we get to the Civil War. But they're still considered, second-class citizens. They're, far below white Americans, and many Black New Yorkers saw service in the Civil War as a way to prove themselves as full citizens. I can fight and I can die for this country just as good as any white man. So DeWitt Hasbrook, who I very briefly mentioned in the talk today, who lives in Staatsburg, serves in the Civil War. He probably sees this as a way to prove himself as a citizen. But then he goes to vote in the 1870s. He's a black man in America. He can vote in the 1870s by order of the U.S. Constitution. And a newspaper reports that he is beaten attempting to vote down in Poughkeepsie. So it's still, even after voting is officially sanctioned and he's a full citizen, you still have all of that going on. Yeah, the Gilded Age is just another chapter in this. Any more questions on Zoom or?
Yeah, I have a question, Richard Franklin.
Go ahead.
What do you think the impact of the 1834 Act of England to abolish slavery, did that impact this area at all in regards to the import of slaves?
Do you
A great impact in the South.
yeah. Do you mean the 1804?
British Empire abolished slavery.
Oh, in
1834.
1834. Oh, I see. So the question was 1834 British abolition of slavery. I don't know how that impacts things here in New York. It probably does have an impact. I personally just don't know. I do know in 1804, which is what I thought you were referring to, in 1804, the transatlantic slave trade is outlawed by the United States, which means you can no longer import enslaved people into the United States. You know, the triangle trade is effectively ends, which does have an impact here in New York, but for much of the time New York has slavery, many of the enslaved people have already been here for a generation or two. There's certainly people coming directly to New York from Africa, people coming directly to Newport. Newport was a huge port for enslaved people, Newport, Rhode Island. Certainly people are coming directly to Africa, but many of the individuals working, especially for the wealthy families that I've been talking about tonight, they are probably a generation or two removed from slavery. So the direct trade doesn't have an immediate impact like that. But I'll have to look more into the 1834 Act, unless if somebody knows.
Well, it certainly had an impact in stimulating the abolitionist movement here,
Interesting.
as well as throughout the United States.
Sure.
And of course, the abolitionism in England had been extremely active.
Yeah.
Earlier than it was here. So, and then you had some of the famous English abolitionists.
Wilberforce.
Exactly. I was just going to say Wilberforce University, Clarkson, another one. So they became icons for our homegrown abolitionists. And of course, Poughkeepsie was a really big center,
Yeah.
an important center for that.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's important to also say, just for the record, that although the international slave trade was outlawed as of 1807, it went on.
Oh, yes.
You know, it was smuggling, and it was profitable. And, you know, we shouldn't think that there weren't any Africans that were still not coming into this country. I think the last slave ship was,
1860, I think.
something,
Something
yeah.
like that. Yeah.
So that's, and so it's a sordid tale that continues. And of course, I mean, there's so many other side stories to this, but of course, that was a stimulation for the internal slave trade, where the northern part of the South, Virginia and Maryland, became places where slaves were essentially bred and sold further south. There was now this really strong commercial need for more enslaved people because of the cotton gin and Southern slavery moving into Texas and into new lands, and you couldn't import them legally anymore. So that led to actually more people were traded internally than were ever imported directly on the international slave trade. So that's
And
a huge impact.
to jump on that too, when slavery is starting to be phased out in New York, you get to the 1820s, you're nearing 1827, you're nearing that end date. A lot of people enslaved in New York are being sold south. Their enslaver can make, one last buck.
Yeah.
Sojourner Truth's son, Peter, forget his name. I think her son Peter is sold in 1827 down to Alabama. And she successfully sues to get him back over in Kingston. She's one of the first Black women to win a court case in New York. But yeah, you see that trade still going on until the very end. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The New York Archive people found the writ of habeas corpus last year. Jim Foltz is going through box after box after box, and he says, wait a minute, yeah, Van Wagenen, wait a minute, that rings a bell. And if it wasn't Jim Foltz, it would just be another piece of paper. But just imagine that discovery.
Yeah.
Van Wagenen.
I have one last question on the follow through on the 7 year that was given to forget the slave name, but in the period. Slavery in the islands, there was the cycle was 7 years. That's why I was curious if that was in fact related to that cycle. They felt that, well, the planters there would feel they would have worn out a slave in 7 years, they would need replacement. So they would gauge their replacement of slaves on a 7-year cycle.
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. I hadn't heard about the 7-year cycle down in the islands.
It's repeated. For
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was the 7-year period that Peter Williams is enslaved. John Jay sets up, he shall serve faithfully for 7 years. And the person had asked, sort of, was that common? Is that related to this practice down in the Caribbean of enslaving someone for 7 years because they thought they would just be worn out by 7 years? They would, they wouldn't be profitable, probably. I hadn't heard that about the Caribbean, but it absolutely makes sense because it was absolutely brutal on the sugar canes. And the Livingston family, who owned Staatsburg, the Livingston family, whom John Jay married into, they own plantations down in the Caribbean, or they did. They're actively profiting, off that labor. So I wasn't aware of that history, but I do know John Jay has this practice of saying he will enslave someone for, it's usually 7 years. We see that pop up a couple times in his records. And it does seem like he does follow through on that. He does manumit that individual, but as soon as he does that, he goes around and enslaves somebody else. He's sort of this revolving door of individuals. We're not I've talked to colleagues down at his home down in Westchester. We're not certain why he does that. There's a couple theories.
I have a theory.
Yeah, what's your theory?
My theory is 7 years was the typical length of an apprenticeship. And Jay was part of this group of men like Hamilton.
Yeah.
Who were founding the Manumission Society and were behind this idea of gradual manumission. And gradual manumission had built into it the concept of serving out a period of indentured servitude. So I would rather assign it to that as the pattern taken from apprenticeship and as being a very conservative, gradual way to go into manumission.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's my thought.
That's
Just
definitely a good
hearing
theory.
it. I mean, just hearing it for the first time.
And just to underscore for anybody, this 7-year period that John Jay does is very much the outlier. Slavery was a lifelong thing. You could be born into it, like we talked earlier. You would have it, as a condition until you either ran away or somebody manumitted you. So this 7-year period is extremely uncommon, even here in New York.
So it was part of a reform effort.
Yeah, I think that would make sense. That would make sense. I think that's it then. It's
Okay.
9 o'clock, so
We've gone on quite a while.
yeah, thank you all so much. This was
Thank you.
This was great.